I bring, a PowerPoint, and I might have it on a thumb drive, etc. But do you know who sets all this stuff up and makes it so that it's really easy? It's Blake Arnold. So just know that. The twin-powered engine that make this thing happen. So anyway, but thanks again for showing up and letting me talk about history, people. That's my favorite thing, probably. So anyway, and I will say also that Jen picked out for our England trip that same set of verses. So I got a twofer. So if I can learn it from Sunday school, I can learn it for England. And I think we need to know that soon. So such a great passage. So what I was going to say is that, so last time we talked about the actual source information related to Christ and really looking at secular sources, if you weren't here, documenting the same information we have in our Bible, right, in the Gospels, really talking about Christ's life and proving its existence through secular sources. Today we're going to be talking about the impact and how that also is another evidence that something happened in Judea around this time. So I'm going to spend some time on that today. And I just would say, even from last week, it's important to remember people like Julius Caesar, historical figures of great importance, Tiberius Caesar. They have 4 or 5 records of their existing in historical written text. And they're usually from historians of the day that actually commented on, like Tacitus. We have like 42 on Jesus' life, which is just an interesting thing to think about. So when people say things like, is there any historical record? There's far more historical record. That's outside the Gospel 42, too. You want to talk the Gospels as historical record, and they're pretty darn accurate. There's all kinds of records for Jesus Christ's life. So I just say that because part of this whole exercise that I'd like you guys to walk away with is that you feel like when people ask those questions or when they throw out ideas related to Christ being just a nice guy or not really around or there's no evidence, there's tons of evidence. So I'm hoping that even in today, you guys will come away a little bit more equipped to have conversations that are good around that. So we're going to evaluate the impact of Christ's ministry on world history through the spread of Christianity following the Acts of the Apostles. I always like calling it the Acts of the Apostles. Matt and I were just talking about Acts this morning, but what an amazing book, and just coming out of it as our group. But the true name is the Acts of the Apostles, right? Because Jesus Christ's Acts were documented in the Gospels and then right into the Acts of the Apostles. We're going to talk about the destruction of the Archetypal Man, which I'll explain that in a little bit. Christianity's impact on philosophy and Western thought. This is a really interesting topic. We're going to just do a high-level overview, but I think it's really important that you guys understand that as well. And then we're going to spend some time on conversion stories, which this is one of the key areas that atheists and others will really attack and say, well, that conversion stories are all made up in miracles and they're politically motivated, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about that today. So, as we get started, might be a little bit better today because I have maps. I love maps. They're so nice. But so this is just kind of the impact of the missionary journeys of so many and the success stories following Jesus' death. But you can see it. By 300, there were pockets everywhere that were real large Christian communities. We know that through historical and archaeological record. But one of the pieces to remember is that it largely followed the Jewish diaspora, right? So with the Jewish communities, usually there would be a Christian sect that was out there as well. But that quickly grew to more of a Gentile base as well. And you can see by 300, it was in pockets everywhere. By 600, it was really all over the entire Roman Empire and actually going into areas that were not part of the Roman Empire originally. So the spread was massive. I bring this up because when you think about what happened in Judea and its impact, it's kind of like I read one Christian historian was talking about if you kind of come across the scene of a massive avalanche, something caused that avalanche, right? You can see the aftermath of this massive impact. And similar to this astonishing growth, something happened in Judea. And I say that because, remember we talked about revisionist history and the kind of the world we're living in, the wisdom of this age that governs us a lot. We've spent years tearing down the massive movement that was about, this 300 to 600 and beyond. that is evidence in and of itself that we need to come to grips with what Jesus' ministry was. I talked about that liar, lunatic, or Lord. As you're talking with people, sometimes I think people kind of try to move beyond that really quickly, gloss over the fact that there's cathedrals all over Western Europe that weren't just built by rich people, but by people that had some sort of faith in something. And I just say that I don't want that to be lost when we're thinking about Jesus' ministry as the impact in Europe and beyond that was very immediate. You can see here we've got monastic communities, and this is by 300 all over the place. So these are devout believers pretty quickly after that. So I'm going to hit you guys with one little video here, because you always got to have a video, but I think this illustrates kind of a point that I'd like to make today. How was that, wasn't it?
Yeah, which one was it?
I want to say it was, there it is.
Who would you say is the most significant person to have ever lived? Aristotle? Caesar Augustus? How about Winston Churchill or George Washington? Or Genghis Khan or Mahatma Gandhi? Or how about Chairman Mao? Of all the influences that have shaped our world as we know it, even most skeptics agree that it was a simple carpenter from the nearby town of Nazareth who was the most influential person to have ever lived. I'm Dave Stotts, and in this series of Drive-Thru History, we're going to explore the extraordinary life in the order that it took place and in the places that it was lived. This is the story of Jesus of Nazareth, also known as the Child of Bethlehem and the Man from Galilee. This is Drive-Thru History, the Gospels.
I kind of say that a little tongue-in-cheek. Drive-through history, the Gospels, which is kind of illustrates the point. And he's absolutely right that most historians agree that the most influential person to ever walk the world in terms of secular history is Jesus Christ. You'll find some folks that want to debate that point because they have a reason to debate that point. But generally, when you think about the impact of Christ on world history, it's massive. So I'm going to spend a little time on that today. But the other pieces I want you guys to focus in on is, this is how we get history right now. Drive-through history. I mean, what are the motivations behind drive-through history, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess what we're trying to say is we only have just a small snippet of time often to evaluate anything. So I appreciate you guys being here to actually kind of look at some source material and actually learn a little bit about history before you end up in a conversation with somebody, which could be a good commentary or a good opportunity for the delivery of the gospel, and all you have at your fingertips is drive-through history. You know what I mean? So anyway, but
hey Andy.
Yeah.
I may have missed it, but we can't see what the colors are. What can you show us?
Yeah, it's kind of small, isn't it? So you can kind of see these little trees, I want to call them. That's a monastic community.
Okay.
So the extent of Christianity is that 300. This is the darker orange. You can see there's a lot of monastic communities popping up there. And then this is an expansion of monasticism. It's kind of showing you where it went. There's a lot of really good things. You guys remember I did actually a discussion. Sorry, I'm going to figure this mic out. We talked about the spread of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. I don't know if you guys were here for that. We talked about that for a while. As you can kind of see, like Ireland was one of the earliest adopters of a very heavy monastic movement, which is one of the reasons why we have most of our historical records are actually from Irish monks scribing in a little beehive hut out in the middle of nowhere. Honestly, we would not have a lot of Tacitus, we would not have a lot of Roman history if it weren't for Irish monks rescribing that on vellum for hundreds of years, which is that's a whole other conversation for another day. But the monastic movement was huge, and a lot of these were ascetics, which we've talked about before, especially down in this area. But that's kind of the spread and kind of the different ages of the spread. Does that make sense, Paul?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good question. So we're going to talk a little bit about why this was such an appealing, attractive, movement for so many, and why it was sort of earth-shattering in world history from a secular history perspective. So who is this guy? Yeah, that's what Jen said. Made me a little nervous. But he is a babe. You didn't say babe.
Good looking, I did not.
You said he's a good-looking dude. Anyway, this guy is very famous. He's so famous that he's the archetypal man, meaning he's the most important man. Augie, what do you think?
I think David.
David? Yeah, he kind of looks like David, doesn't he? Yeah, that's a pretty good guess, Augie. This guy is Alexander the Great, right? And this is the archetypal man. If you think about in Jesus' time, even the Romans, everybody respected the Great, right? Cities named after him everywhere. Alexandria. The Greek language is everywhere for a reason, right? How many battles did Alexander the Great lose as he went 1,000 miles across empires? How many battles?
0.
0. So, I mean, this is the guy, right? Everybody wants to be Alexander the Great. In fact, this is a lifelike rendering of him that they say is they think, almost 100% accurate to how he actually looked, because there are so many statues of him that have different traits, and contemporary statues. So this was the guy, And then you've got Jesus, who kind of espouses this martyrdom. You got this guy who never loses battles. This idea that the quintessential or the archetypal most successful man is the guy who doesn't lose battles, marches across territory, and wins wars. And then you've got this Jesus who is a martyr. Very, very difficult thing for the Roman and Greek world to understand, and very divided in terms of how they are evaluating what is success. And during the same time, you've also got this discussion on the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of man. It's really, really easy to destroy kingdoms for Rome and Greece and other conquering type folks. But it's very difficult to get after somebody who is evaluating their life in terms of eternal perspectives, right? And we know that as Christians, but this was extremely hard. If you read through the history, they cannot figure out why they can't crush this. People keep dying, they do horrible things to them, and they're sad for the people, and they're also just, how lost are these people that they can't understand that Roman power is what you should be at? That sticking point continues to pop up all over the Western world for the next several hundred years. And I say that and bring it up because the Christian movement of ministry and how that actually spread is very different than other religious movements. If you think about Muhammad, it was a conquering entity that was moving out. The spread was based on conquering, and this is a very different way of spreading a religion. And that's what happened in those early years. And a lot of times you'll be in conversations with folks where they will say things like, wow, Christianity was all based on warfare and blah, blah, blah. The first 600 years, it had nothing to do with warfare. In fact, they were the persecuted minority, right? And not the first 600, 300. We're going to talk a little bit about Constantine in a minute. But just something to remember that it was the antithesis of the archetypal man. Jesus Christ's life was the antithesis of that. I think this comes up even today in the sense that we all gravitate back towards that. If you think of a Russian leader right now, there's lots of, you kind of want that conquering hero to go out and smash your neighbor. The philosophy that fights against that, and this is what I'm trying to drive home with this point, is a Christian philosophy, right? The world still evaluates things that way. When we say it's not right to crush your neighbor, that's throughout human history, that is actually a foreign thought. And I don't think people realize that a lot. The world has always gravitated towards the strong man that protects you and crushes your neighbor. The moderating influence in Western society through all kinds of, with the Geneva Conventions, and going back to the peace of God with the Catholic Church, all that moderating influence was based in a Christian ethos, if that makes sense. The life of Christ informed how we combat that discussion. That doesn't come up a lot when you have conversations because people think, well, we're so much more evolved beyond this because of our knowledge base or Western society. I'm telling you folks, it's all about Jesus. The whole reason that we try to moderate those, evil conquering scenarios. So I just bring that up. So I'm going to spend a little time on Christ's ministry and its impact on Western civilization. The Eastern world and the ancient world was all based on community, right? And so the individual was not a very respected or thought of thing, which I'm going to spend a little time on even in the Gospels here in a second. But people saw themselves as a part of a group, or as a part of a community. The discussion on individual rarely came up, right? So if you were an Assyrian, you were an Assyrian. You had the Assyrian religion that you were part of, the language, etc., etc. If the Assyrians went to war with somebody, that was your war. There wasn't discussions about what my own philosophy or thought process was. Following Christ, there's a real introspective look on each one of us in terms of, is this what's right for me? And I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit. And this is in Paul, conscience and individuation. A lot of people don't realize that St. Paul and his descriptions, which are so crucial to Christianity and the spread of Christianity, was one of the first people that actually really talked about individuation in human history. So from a secular perspective, when you're evaluating Christianity, these are the types of influences and gifts that Christianity gave to the world. Is that the fact that they really focused more on the I. Now the secular person will tell you that's because that all came out of the Greek philosophies and kind of Plato and but Paul took that to another level. I'm going to kind of show you an example of that. Some of you want to read Romans 7:15 through 25. I'm going to do a sword drill. Just go ahead and start reading when you get there.
For I did not understand my own actions.
Oh, let me cut you off just for a second. I forgot. This is the whole exercise I wanted to do. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I want you to count how many times the word I is used. All right, now we can go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God, in my inner being. But I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind. But with my flesh I serve the law of sin.
All right. Thank you. Caleb, how many?
23.
23 eyes.
25. 4.
25? 4? There's a lot there. Depending on translation, as Matt knows, it's all about the translation. No. So a lot of eyes, right? We didn't even count the me's or my's or everything else.
I might have actually counted.
I'm just telling you guys that because that is very different in history. From a historical record, you don't hear a lot of eyes or a lot of introspection or individuation, they call that, where you're calling yourself out from the group and doing self-analysis and that sort of thing. Again, that thought process is coming out of this Christian ethos where there's a Holy Spirit that's informing our path, our individual path, right? And that whole discussion is another one of the gifts that Christianity gave to all of the world, where there's people that have a conscience, right? Go ahead,
I have
Vicki.
a question, because in the beginning of Acts, it's all groups that become, me and my house.
Right.
The man with his whole household.
Yep.
And then Paul sort of changes up how they group.
Yeah. I honestly think it is, and when you think, and I'm going to go into conversion stories a little bit, and you'll notice it's nations that convert, usually, right? But the whole idea of, I think, an individual conscience, and that's informing our path, that we war against ourselves in our own soul, those types of things, is what kind of came out of, I think, the Holy Spirit's gift to the world. And also this idea that we have a place that exists beyond this world, which again is a very, if you're a Greek or you're Roman, the gods interact both in kind of an eternal realm and in the current realm. They're playing around doing all kinds of nasty stuff and everybody else, whereas we are investing in something that's beyond ourselves. So, yeah.
Well, and Jesus saying you have to hate your father and mother and follow me, that goes right against the
Absolutely.
the community, the collective, and
That's a great point, Lindsay.
Individual.
Absolutely, I should put that in the PowerPoint. That's actually that's a great point. I think that is him starting that conversation, right? It's, you may need to go against your community. Your community might be going a different direction, and I'm going to call you out of that to do something else. And you can see that through Judaic history. Like you think about Abraham, he's called out of his community, those sorts of things. But it really doesn't take its shape until all of us are navigating our individual path, following Christ's death on a cross for all of us, and ransoming our lives and storing up an eternal treasure. So that is one of the reasons why Christianity is so successful in the early mind, is everybody's doing things for what's right in front of them, right? We actually had an amazing, I'm not going to talk about it, Jen. We had an amazing thing on that this morning. Jen might share later, but anyway, but that doing things not because there's an immediate benefit, if that makes sense. So, great point, Lindsay. And again, I kind of spent some time on this already, but a higher ethic or moral which is beyond human understanding. And I don't think I'm going to go into this much today, but if you guys want to read about Augustine's City of God, kind of goes through some of these ideas as well, but this idea of a place existing beyond ours, that's what this picture is too.
Andy, what's a rough date for Augustine?
350, I think he was born. All right, who is this guy?
Augustine of Hippo.
No, but good guess. And it ends with esteem. And Augustine was from Hippo too.
Constant.
That was good. What was that?
Hippo.
Constantine.
Constant Hippo or Constantine? Yes, Constantine is the right answer. I love it. Thanks, Ronan. All right, so this guy is Constantine. By the way, where is this statue at? I've seen it. I don't know if anybody of you guys have seen it. If you think about where I lived, you might. It's in York, believe it or not. Northern England, that statue. Why is that statue in York? It's just an interesting
Because
question.
they stole it.
They stole it. No. Constantine was actually, if you think about,
Here's the
he was stationed in York when he was crowned emperor, which just talks about the mammoth. I mean, that was in 312, I think. It was right around the 300. He had the Roman Empire was so powerful that it had, people up in York, northern England, right, that were powerful enough to literally get crowned to be emperor and come back down. And then 200 years later, the Anglo-Saxons are just burning that place. But anyway, that's another story. But I'm just saying, like, that York was a very powerful city, right? It's called Iberacum. But at the time, and I say that because, just interesting things about the Roman Empire at the height of its power. So he's Constantine the Great, and why is he called the Great? Partially because he wins a lot of wars, but he's also the guy that converts to Christianity. And you will hear about this all the time when people talk about, the Roman Empire was eventually made Christian because he just was using it as a power center for him to be able to control the empire and then win a war. There's a lot of truth in that. I mean, if you look back to his kind of story about how he prayed at a bridge and wins a war, and then of course he said, if I win this war, then I'm going to turn the entire empire Christian, essentially. He does win the war and then turns the empire Christian. That's the story, right? And you'll hear these kind of conversion story discussions where folks will say, that was totally based on politics, or that was totally based on winning a war, or that was, and so I'm going to kind of go through some of these kind of critiques that are out there. But while that is partially true, there is also evidence that Constantine was a Christian. He's talking about the I. He's spending time in an introspective state. Could be all politics, right? But how many times have people prayed for a test or all kinds of things? I guess what I'm saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when you have these conversations with people. And I say that because that's what you will get. It's like, well, that was just all political. How do you know that? You know what I mean? Yeah. The guy spends the rest of his life espousing himself to be a believer. Is he living in a fallen world? Absolutely, just like all of us are. But I just say that because there's a lot of this revisionist history which makes you discount all these people of the past. All of our Christians, oh, you got to discount that because of this. You got to discount that because of that. And be like, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with most of these people recognizing they're fallen human beings trying to do the same thing we are, right? In actuality, Constantine, creates a pretty peaceful environment for Rome and turns, the monastic movement into something that really gets huge. You see those differences between 300 and 600. Well, Constantine is 312, I think, is the Battle of the Bridge when the Roman Empire becomes Christian. 300 to 600, massive explosion of Christianity and monastic movement. And in these days, again, going back to community-based conversion, most of the nations of the world and chiefs, you convert the chief, right? We were just in Maui the other day, or last couple weeks ago, and the story of Maui, I don't know if you guys know, but the queen, one of the queens of the king, accepts the Lord and then kind of convinces the descendant of Kamehameha, to convert. That's pretty much most of the nation's stories of conversion, right? There's somebody at the high level that converts and then everybody else is converted. And you will hear from people, well, it just shows you, none of those people believed anything and the whole thing was about power dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. Again, going back to until people understood Christianity, they didn't have an I. That I wasn't even there. You did whatever your king did. You were part of that identity. If your king switches to Christianity, you're now a Christian. That's how it works. People didn't think like, individual rights had much say or discussion. And I just say that because, just because a king converted and then and all of his people showed up at the river, that's how everything happened in those days. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's just a different way of looking at history. By the way, first Christian nation in the world. It's close. That's two. I mean, in terms of a king and a nation state converting. Anyone? I'll tell you, it is Armenia. If you've ever talked to an Armenian, they will tell you, yes, we were the first Christian nation. By the way, there's 4 quarters in Jerusalem. It's too bad Darrell Hill and, isn't it Bob Spear and Darrell Hill are in Jerusalem now? I could ask them this question. Has anybody been to Jerusalem in here? Vicky has. So there's 4 quarters in Jerusalem. Anybody want to take a stab at what those quarters are? I'll give you a huge hint. Augie, what do you think? It's different nations. And I'll tell you what, that 3 of the 4 are based on a religion. It's kind of a hard question. Ronan, you got a guess?
Is it how they do it?
Well, here's what it is. The 3 of the 4 are religions. There's the Muslim quarter, there's the Jewish quarter, and there's the Christian quarter, right? But the 4th quarter is called the Armenian Quarter. And that's because the Armenians, when they converted, had a delegation sent down there, and they've been there ever since. So even after the diaspora with the Turks, they sent an influx of people. So you can look that up. I've never been to Jerusalem, but I always thought it'd be interesting to go to the Armenian Quarter, because it's all done with Armenian motifs and everything else. And it's all because they were the first nation state to convert. You really want to go, you really want to go deep into this, the Kardashians, so that'd be hip and trendy, are Armenians, right? I don't know if you guys know this, but after the Turkish diaspora, they all got pushed to LA, and so they go back to Armenia a lot. And actually, I think, if I remember right, this is, okay, now I'm really on a bunny trail, but I think, what's his name? Kanye, right? Married Kim. They, I want to say, went to the Armenian Quarter of Jerusalem and baptized one of their kids. I'm almost positive of that story. Anyway, check the tabloids. There you go. So, but there's lots of history there.
Anyway,
Yeah. Come on, Paul, you know you're into that Kardashian history. So Kievan Rus, so this is Russia, right? It's quite a bit later. This is in the 9th century, 800s. I bring that up because that's really in the whole news right now too. And this is after the conversion of the Eastern Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. And so they trace all of their lineage back to, Constantinople. But they have a conversion story, just like the Armenians. The Armenians' conversion story is the king was convinced by a long-suffering missionary who actually spent time in a pit, kind of suffering for trying to reach out to these people. And he was convinced one day through a dream and through conversations with this guy to convert his entire people group. And so he did. There's no evidence of political thought there. It'd be hard to because it was so long ago. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's like you will hear that story and in revisionist history, you will hear that guy, oh, that's not real Christianity, that has nothing to do with anything. Well, the truth is the Armenian church has flourished for thousands of years, and so somebody converted someone. Same thing with the Kievan Rus. And then, of course, the Anglo-Saxon conversion, I've got to spend some time on that because that's what my master's degree is in. But again, it was over time through missionaries that converted the Anglo-Saxon. Saint Aidan was actually who was credited with converting the Anglo-Saxons. Here you go, Aidan. That's why it's spelled with the Irish. So, but there's lots of conversion stories, and they all involve a kind of political intrigue in the sense that the king accepted the Lord, and then the people did it. So, again, I just put that out there because you will hear again politicized narratives that really have no basis in history outside of the fact that we spent now 1,000 years trying to break down how they could have a political influence. So that I wanted to leave a lot of question and discussion time just for you guys. And I think we're almost at time, but we didn't get any discussion time last time. But I'm just kind of curious, what do you guys hear when you talk about history? You talk about Christianity, and people will kind of discount elements of that. What do you have an uncomfortable time actually presenting to others when you talk about the history of our faith? Sean?
Well, I guess a question for you would be, how would you respond to a student who is in a conversation and, the critique that comes is, well, Christianity is just like the Archetypal Man. It turned into a religion of conquering, and it's not what it started out to be. I don't want to be a part of that. It's just like everything else. Why be a part of Christianity? It's no different.
Right.
And they'll go to the Crusades.
Yes.
They do all those.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. One of the things that I spend a lot of time on these kinds of conversations, because I really enjoy these conversations, because at least if somebody gets there, you're actually in a space that you can actually kind of hopefully spread the gospel a little. When you think about some of the elements of the moderating influence of the church, which we, again, discredit, Catholic Church, bad, bad, bad. Well, to be honest, we owe them a heck of a lot for our current, religion and practice. Their attempts at actually trying to moderate behavior, like with the Germanic, the peace of God or the truce of God, those are documents I'm not going to talk about today, but basically they made it so that there was enough holidays in a year that you couldn't have war on the holiday. The Geneva Convention, all the types of pieces that we've tried to moderate war comes from this heart that there's something else out there that should moderate our lifestyle. That's, I guess, what I'm saying. If you go to other parts of the world and they're at war with somebody, there's not a discussion about, the rules of the war a lot, unless it's coming from kind of a Western informed ethos, right? And you got to go really deep into that to really understand that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is just the idea that we should not have a will to power, as Nietzsche said, is, it's a Christian thought in and of itself. The fact that we even have these discussions about war being criminal and that sort of thing, the Crusades were bad, that's a Christian thought in and of itself. And I guess what I'm trying to say, and you kind of got to spend some time with folks about different events and things. But what I would just what I caution you about is to not feel like you have to defend. Say human beings are fallen people, right? But the fact that I know that's wrong and you know that's wrong, that is coming from an informed space, and that's what Jesus is all about. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's a difficult question, but it's not one that we should give up on because it's such a red herring in terms of all of human history. You know what I mean? All of human history is full of wars. It's very difficult to control that urge. And I mean, as we know in the Bible, there'll be a time for war and there's a time for peace. So I think it's just important for us to understand that that is not the fault of Christianity, but Christianity has an answer for that. So, yeah, Skylar.
But just kind of to piggyback off of that, one of the things that, just the kind of the point of interest for a lot of people is just the humanitarian benefit for, look at Christianity, go look at all the wrong or the evil that it's caused, but you can, sure that I think that can be there and that is there, but you can look at all of the other, the fruits that have been born because of Jesus. And John Stott has a book on this. John Ortberg did a really good job talking about just things like human rights or the individual that kind of develops freedom. But one of the things that I was just thinking about with talking about conversion, and you have kind of these mass amounts of people that convert. If you look at how does the early church respond to that, because that happens, right, with households coming to Christ, and that very much are focused on, well, let's actually teach them, right? So there's an education that is built into that about what you actually believe, which would be void from a lot of other, surrounding religions, and they would just kind of be based on fear or ignorance or whatever. The whole Jesus way of doing things is like, let's actually elevate and empower people to know what they believe, which is totally counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even women and slaves and have this equal access to this knowledge. And so, I mean, how cool is that, So.
And very against the, history of the world. I mean, the empowering of regular people to have individual thought.
Yeah.
It's just an anecdotal, more recent thing, but when we were on the Yukon, and Bob and Carol can probably talk more about than I could, but in the villages where Christianity came in, the darkness is different.
Yeah.
You can actually feel the darkness when you go into the really, really dark villages and the evil.
Yeah.
And when Christianity comes in, I know the believers from the villages would talk about that place. And you can actually feel it. It's just amazing when the Holy Spirit is with a group of people. They somehow permeate the village in a different way that, I can't describe it. There's no real way to prove it.
Yeah.
But even people that weren't believers up and down the Yukon would comment on which villages felt safer or they would feel the presence.
Right. Well, it's interesting too, and I'm kind of curious to get your guys' thoughts on the mission field. To this day, when you go into a new community, you're usually dealing with the elders of the community or people that are very influential in the community usually, are you not? Wouldn't you say even to this day? Yeah, I say that because, it's kind of similar to how ministry is done today to unreached peoples.
Our first thought when we went into the village, well, if that guy becomes a believer,
right.
That would be really good.
Right.
You pick out which, and they're the influential people.
Yeah, the elders or, so anyway, and because you will hear that, and that's one of the biggest, things it talks about being discredited. We should probably wrap up on that. Time or one more question?
Well, it's not a question really, but
yeah.
To piggyback on what was said is that still happens today. One person in a family will become a Christian, and the influence of being around that person. So it's not that weird. Yes, it happens with kings and their households, but it happens with everybody.
Yeah.
Because it's part of
yeah.
your witness to the people that you live with.
Right. Even Paul, his emphasis on getting to Caesar's household, right?
Yeah.
So that's no different, and I think it's a good calling for all of us to think about our influence as leaders of our families and things and the impact that that has. I think we all understand that. I thought Lindsay's point about Jesus also calling us sometimes to go against the herd, and that's a really astute point in the sense that, again, that's that individual gift that we've been given. So when you hear about people exercising their freedoms and all, that is a gift from Christianity. So while there are wars and there are lots of negative, horrible things, there are lots of very positive, wonderful gifts that even a secular person will see that Jesus gave to the world. And so then it comes back to this discussion, liar, lunatic, or Lord. And that's where you want to get to have that gospel moment. So,
Thank you, Andy.